Lovely to have all of you with us. And Lisa, I want to go to you first because at a very young age, you found yourself in the crosshairs of politics and sport with the Moscow Olympics and pressure for athletes not to go. What was that like for you?
Oh, it was an extraordinary time. But I think that, as we just saw, the Olympics or the 70s were an amazing time anyway. And Anthony will tell you about the rugby bans. But so the first Olympics that I ever read about, I was 8 years old and I had to read out loud from the newspaper to my dad to improve my vocabulary and my reading. And I read about the girls the first week in Munich, where Shane Gould and Gail Neal and Bev Whitfield saved Australia's sporting pride, is the way that it was written. They won 5 gold medals out of our total of 8. And the second week, I read about, gunmen in the Israeli village. And so I knew that the Olympics were an incredible stage. It was, this opportunity to go beyond your best. And at the same time, it transcended sport. So, I made the calculation. I was 8 in 1972 and I'd be 16 in 1980, which would be the perfect, age at that time, not knowing that that would be Moscow. And of course, the 6 months prior to those games were extraordinary. And it was one of those things where, prior to any sort of media training, it was conversations around the dinner table, with mum and dad. What do you think? And essentially, as you say, sport has that extraordinary power. It's got the power that the rugby players, the Australian rugby players started with apartheid, to actually say, this is what's going on and we are going to take a stand. But also, it's got the power to bring people together. And that was what we used to say about Moscow, like sport can build bridges that politics breaks. And
of course, Anthony Abraham, sport can build bridges, but when you took a stand against sporting ties with South Africa, it was not a popular thing to do, was it?
It certainly wasn't, no. And I was pretty much in a quandary to decide whether I should go to South Africa, because I'd documented myself pretty well before the tour. And I consulted 7 older and wiser men than I, who were from the law and outside the law. And finally, I decided to go, partly because they said it would be the foolish gesture of one who didn't know if I didn't see it first. And so I went and very quickly saw the colour of apartheid.
What did that do for you, Anthony, to experience that firsthand? What impact did it have on you?
It wasn't just me, it was the whole team. I mean, we were shocked by what they call petty apartheid, the notices on park benches, reserving them for black or white, largely white, the separated toilets and all the rest of it. And then there was the political side, where the rule of law was completely undermined. There was no longer any due process. Fair trials were only maintained when the judiciary stood up, which it did quite well at times, to the government. And generally, you were in it was a police state.
Ellis Cashmore, I want to bring you on this with the bigger question, I suppose. We always hear, whenever an athlete stands up, decides to challenge authority, that they're told, stick to sport. Sport and politics do not mix. Of course, they're inseparable, aren't they?
Yes, it's a match made in heaven, isn't it, Stan, if you think about it? Particularly nowadays, because practically every major sporting tournament or event is publicised thanks to a global media. And that means that you have enormous viewing audiences. I mean, it's a natural theatre. So anybody who has got a political point that they want to make or an ideological platform that they want to promote is naturally going to be drawn to sport. I mean, you could try and hijack the Oscar ceremonies or, try and muscle in on some TV show like the X Factor. But there's nothing quite like sport if you really do want to get your political message across. So that's what I mean by a match made in heaven. And I don't think they ever will be separable. I mean, another thing to remember about the Olympics, Stan, is that they were political from the outset. In the late 19th century, when the modern Olympics were born, the idea was to bring nations together in a spirit of harmony and to try to promote good relations between nations. Of course, it didn't quite work out, as we know. But that was the intention.
Yeah, Ellis, I wanted to stay with you, and I'll come to Lisa in just a moment on this point, but we often look at the impact that sport will have for good and to bring about change in politics, but quite often it is sports organisations in countries that kowtow to repressive regimes. The New Zealand rugby with South Africa, the English team who would not pick black players to travel, the English cricket team, to travel to South Africa.
That's right.
They don't often take the high ground, do they?
No, and I don't think you can do anything about individual responsibilities in situations like this. There have been a number of cases where the individual athletes have said one thing, and then the nations they supposedly represent have said quite another. And I don't think we're ever going to come to a conclusion one way or another, whether sport and politics is a good thing or a bad thing. It's a double-edged sword, Stan, isn't it? Because you can look back, I mean, we've just had an earlier reference to the disaster in Munich, the massacre there, and every right-thinking person in the world is going to look back at that and think, what an awful, catastrophic event that was, and that was politics and sport mixing at its most menacing. On the other hand, you've also referenced the '68 Olympics, the Black Power salutes. And we thought at the time, you know, the world condemned Smith and Carlos and said, you know, they hardly competed ever again. And yet, at the end of the 20th century, people look back on the great sporting events and they thought, my word, wasn't this a watershed moment? And now we realise, in retrospect, what a great pivotal symbolic gesture that was in 1968. And as you quite rightly said earlier, there has been this tidal movement starting from the Gleneagles Agreement to ostracize South Africa and bring to the attention of the world that they did have this hideous system of apartheid that they were operating. And I don't think we should underestimate the part played by the boycott of South Africa in bringing about an end to this regime. So sport has played a very important political part, one way or the other.
Lisa, I was just listening to Ellis saying there that an athlete may say something and the government may say something else. That was you. That was your situation, and you were called or made to feel like a traitor, weren't you?
And certainly the shock jocks were calling us that. I mean, the Daily Telegraph was saying we should have our passports taken from us because it's a privilege, not a right, to have an Australian passport. I think that one of the interesting, the situations is when we talk about the South African apartheid change and everything that Anthony and his group started was that it was supported economically as well. There was, the late Pat Garrity, who was head of the Seamen's Union, who was also very supportive of the athletes raising money for us to go to Moscow. They were very much part of supporting that bloc of South Africa, whereas when it came to Moscow, that we weren't getting that sort of support. If it was a situation where we could have changed the situation for women and children in Afghanistan, then of course you would do it. But at the same time, everyone else, nobody else wanted to. We still wanted to sell wheat, we still wanted to sell wool, we still wanted to sell our minerals. So that was the difference. I do think that there's, when we talk about the men in the 200 metres in 1968, as well as our own Peter Norman, who didn't raise his hand but certainly wore the badge that supported those men, that in many ways that continuum is alive today with Colin Kaepernick taking the knee with the, and so we have to
equally condemned, which we've heard from Donald Trump.
And also what I think that one of the things that we tend to think is that the money will sort of keep everybody conservative. So these guys, like me, I wasn't earning money. Anthony probably wasn't earning money. Even the Tommy. John Carlos and Tommy Smith weren't earning money, so we had reputations. Ultimately, we're standing for something. But Colin Kaepernick, lost his job. Like these guys are paid a lot of money, and so that is really interesting too, that they are willing to take that stand and I think inspire others around them.
Anthony, we look at the impact of what you helped begin there because you wrote a letter and that public letter saying that Australia should reconsider sporting ties with South Africa. All those years later, the end of apartheid, Mandela is president, they hold the Rugby Union World Cup in South Africa and he seizes that moment. What did that do to unify the country?
I think it was one of the most sublime moments of a political gesture in sport. constituting a very major unifying element in South Africa. When he decided to wear Francois Pienaar, the Springbok captain's number 6 jersey, and walked out onto that field, it was probably one of the great sporting moments and one of the great political gestures. And I think there are other circumstances where an individual athlete has pushed forward the awareness of a particular issue. Kathy Freeman just running around the field after her wins leading up to the Sydney Olympics, and with the Aboriginal flag around her shoulders. Look, there are a number of others. It's probably quite surprising.
Muhammad Ali, for example.
Muhammad Ali,
yeah.
Well, absolutely. It's probably quite surprising that sport hasn't been used more blatantly in situations than it has been. And I think that raises the issue of when it's appropriate, if you like, and when it's not.
I want to bring Ellis in on this, Ellis, and going back to when the games became ultra politicized. 1936, Munich in Germany. Yeah. Of course, Hitler
Berlin.
seizing on that as an expression of Nazi power in a televised games, and a man named Jesse Owens spoils the party for him.
Yeah. Well, he did and he didn't. He won his events, and obviously that was taken as a slight against Hitler personally, and of course the entire ideological thrust of Nazism. But in another sense, it was a great triumph for Hitler, because he showed the world that he was able administratively to run a gigantic show quite smoothly as well, and it went without noticeable hitches. So the idea of it was, and it still is, I suppose, in a certain sense, if you're able to stage an Olympics, you've arrived on the world stage. You're a global power. That's exactly what he wanted to prove. You know, one thing, Stan, that we haven't mentioned so far, and forgive me for moving the discussion along a little bit too quickly, but I think we have seen one of the most historically important political dimensions of sport over the past 18 months, 2 years. I'm talking about the condemnation and the disqualification of Russia from Olympic Games. And not only their Olympic teams, but their Paralympian teams have also been disqualified because of this so-called state-sponsored doping. Now, I'm asked time and again, is this political? Well, of course it is. This is one of the great political developments in sport, because we have a Canadian professor who has conducted an investigation into Russian doping. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying doping doesn't go on in Russia any more than it goes on in every other country in the world. But Russia has been singled out, and of course he authored a report that alleges state-sponsored doping, that term state-sponsored
Ellis,
doping.
just on that, I want to bring Lisa in on that. If you consider your experience, Lisa, I don't want to remind you of what was potentially a bad experience. You've often said that you felt you let Australia down because you didn't perform as you would have wished in your event in Moscow. But that experience, going through that, the pressure of performance, the pressure of the politics, just listening to what Ellis has to say then about the tainting of games with doping, did you ever lose that faith in the Olympic movement?
I don't think so.
Good for you.
I think it's, one of those things. I often think it's like, there's that kind of, there are just some people who want to run away with the circus. Like, I think there's just some of us who get sort of somehow we want to run away with that circus. And so, of course, there's politics. I mean, I'm probably one of the, in many ways, swimming is the oddest sport in the sense that we're kind of self-selecting. If you come first, and if you come second, at least in Australia, and make the qualifying time, you're in. There's politics everywhere else. I used to, even with the, when I wrote Boycott, I used to say to everyone when I was interviewed, look, no politics in sport is very different to the politics of sport. It's all pervasive. But I think, ultimately, there are those ideals that we all have if we're drawn to it, like, the idea of sportsmanship, of courage, of fairness, of kind of pushing ourselves to limits. And I think that's probably why we do respond to athletes when, I mean, yes, people get angry at, maybe an athlete taking a stand, but I think the majority of people want to be able to take a stand. They admire an Adam Goodes, or they admire a Colin Kaepernick or Muhammad Ali because they stand for something. I think that's a willingness that not people are.
And even if they're condemned at the time, we know that history has a way of reversing that later, and Muhammad Ali is a great example. We're out of time. A terrific conversation. You did mention your book there, Boycott, Lisa. Lisa did write a book, Boycott, about that a long time ago, but I'm sure you can still find it somewhere. Ellis Cashmore, terrific to talk to you, and Anthony Abrams, good to talk to you as always,
Stan.
Anthony. Nice to see you again.
Thanks very
much
much
for that.